Hello everyone, welcome to the glass houses of the University of Canterbury. We're here today to have a look at some of the smaller types of plants which most people don't notice. And as well as plants such as mosses and liverworts, we're also going to have a quick look at some lichens and also at some algae. And we'll be visiting 2 or 3, maybe 4 locations. The first location is over there, an old glass house full of larger plants that you can see which are used for teaching, and amongst those larger plants we're going to see some algae and a particular type of alga called a blue-green alga. And over here on my right, slightly more modern glass house, and in there we will see some different types of algae. And then we move over there, and down there there's a stream, and as you probably know, streams and rivers, ponds and lakes are really good places for the growth of algae. But we're also going to look on the bark of the tree, which I think you can see. And even from here you can probably see lichens and green growths of moss on the trunk of the tree. So 3 locations, and the types of plants we're going to be looking at are mosses, liverworts, lichens, which aren't really a plant actually, more about that later, and then various types of algae, including blue-green algae, or as they're scientifically called, cyanobacteria. So here we are at the first location in the glass house, and on the bench in front of us, someone's doing an experiment, and they've collected soil and put it in all these trays, and I think they're looking at which weeds will come up. But before any plants have come up, some algae, some mosses and some liverworts have grown. So let's take advantage of that and have a look at some of these simple photosynthetic organisms. Now, first off, can you see what I'm pointing to here? Looks like nothing on earth really, just a little lump of soft green material. This is an alga. It's a soil alga. It's growing on the surface of this moist soil, and it's a particular type of soil alga. It's a blue-green alga, scientific name cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, are very common in soils. Whether it's soils in a glass house like this or the soils outside, amongst the grass outside there'll be lots of blue-green algae. The soils in your back garden or wherever. So this blue-green alga, it's called nostoc, spelled N-O-S-T-O-C, and it's a particular type of blue-green alga which can fix nitrogen. In other words, it can take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere, absorb it, and convert that nitrogen gas into ammonia, and then the ammonia is used to make amino acids. So it's a pretty clever blue-green alga, that one. Now, if we move over here, what we're looking at in this tray are 2 very simple plants. So these aren't algae, these are actual green plants. And this one here, which you can see, which forms ribbons in a sort of rosette shape, that's a liverwort, a so-called Fallow's liverwort. And around it are some growths of moss. Not this plant here, this is a small flowering plant. That's one of the weeds that they're researching, I think. But by that weed, you can see these tiny patches of green. Well, that's moss. Now, if we can pick a little bit of that up and bring it closer to the camera, you might be able to see the small leaves of the moss. So the whole plant is only a few millimeters in height. And again, these mosses you find all over the place. In between paving stones, even in a city centre where people are trampling and bikes are cycling over them all day. In the protected cracks between paving stones where there's a bit of moisture, you're likely to find mosses growing. And actually on this tray from which I've taken that sample of moss, you can see another structure here. Might not be so clear unless I pick a bit up, bring it closer to the camera. You can see these stalk-like structures with a so-called capsule on the end of the stalk. Well, this is a structure that the moss forms when it is reproducing. And this is sexual reproduction. So you get fertilization of a sperm cell and an egg, and then that develops into this stalk with a capsule on the end. And in the capsule, there will be thousands and thousands of spores, which eventually will be dispersed in the wind currents. So I'll put that back in its tray so it can continue doing its thing. So, yep, you've seen a blue-green alga, a moss that's reproducing, and also a liverwort. Right, here we are at the second location in another greenhouse. And often greenhouses are really good places for finding different types of algae. You find them as crusts over surfaces, especially where the surface has been moistened or received water from watering the plants. And even down on the floor down here, you can see these green crusts of algae. So that's one type of alga. But inside this cabinet, there are several different types of algal growth. Along the edge here, which obviously hasn't been cleaned for a fair while, these really rich growths of algae have developed, forming mats. And there'll be all sorts of different algae in these mats if you looked at them down a microscope. But I think these are still dominated by the blue-green algae, which we looked at previously. And they all grow together. There'll be billions and billions of them in this sample, all growing together to form a mat. And yep, definitely blue-green algae. The undersurface of the mat is that quite rich blue-green colour. So we can put that back to where it was before. And look over here on the gravel surface. And the algae aren't growing here where the gravel's really dry, but they are growing here where the gravel's quite moist. And again, the alga is forming a mat. And this is a different mat to the one we've just looked at. Here it is. Maybe you can see a few details of it. There are tiny little sharply pointed columns of alga going upwards and all merging together to form a mat. So two different types of mats. And these blue-green algae, if they dry out, they can survive being dry for really long periods of time. And if we look over here, here's some wonderful dried out mats of blue-green algae. If you added water to these, they'd just start photosynthesizing again. Their metabolism would just start up. But they're just sitting there in a dry, desiccated state. And over at the back of the cabinet, there's yet another type of alga, and this one's forming a different coloured mat. The mat in this case is an orangey colour. So different types of algae will form these growths of different colours and different shapes. And again, there'll be millions and millions of individual algae all joining together to form this rather, what's it like? It's like a bit of a plastic bag in a way, forming a thin mat. When you look at it sideways, you can see how thin it is compared to face on. So let's put that again back where it was. So glass houses, great places to find all sorts of different types of algae. And it's best really if you've got a microscope and you can take a tiny portion of one of these mats, put it on a microscope slide, put a cover glass on top, put it on the microscope, and then peer down at the individual cells in the sample. Right, well, the stream's down there. We're not going to go down to it today, but it's just worth mentioning where there's fresh water, as in a nice flowing stream like that, you'll find lots of algae, and you might also find aquatic mosses and liverworts attached to stones on the bed of the stream. So streams, really good habitats for the organisms that we've been talking about. But this location is particularly good for lichens, because on the trunk and the large branches of this tree, we've got some really good specimens of lichens. Now, what is a lichen? It's not really a plant, although often people call them plants. Strictly, they're not plants. A lichen really is a mixture of fungi and algae. And they live together. They help one another. It's a so-called symbiosis, and a type of symbiosis called a mutualism. In other words, mutualism, each member of the symbiosis is helping the other member. So the algae do photosynthesis, capture sunlight, capture CO2, make sugars, use the sugars for the growth of the alga, but also pass some of the sugars onto the fungi. And the fungi use those sugars for growth. Whereas the fungus within the lichen forms a living place for the algae. So the fungus forms a meshwork, and this meshwork can hold moisture, and the algae need moisture to grow. So the fungus is providing a good living environment for the alga, and the alga is providing sugars which the fungus needs to grow. So this is a nice lichen here, a green one, but there are other ones as well. There are probably several species on the tree, but this one's more obviously different. This yellowish green lichen. And I'll bring a couple of these closer, and maybe you can see the contrast perhaps between those two different types of lichens. And are there any others? Oh, there's another one here. This one looks different again. Let's just grab one little bit. And this one forms small shrubby-like structures. So each of these different lichens will contain different fungi and probably different algae as well in this so-called mutualistic symbiosis. There's also moss on the tree trunk as well, moss similar to the moss we saw in the first glass house that we visited. But this moss isn't forming those stalks and capsules, so it isn't yet reproducing. So, yep, tree trunks, really good habitats for some of these tiny photosynthetic organisms.